My ex screamed, "I'm the baby's father," while charging at us with a knife. He'd used that lie to stalk me for 26 months, and the system kept letting him. He didn't know we had DNA results and 112 pages of evidence. In court, one sentence finally broke him. My name is Ryan. I'm 31, 6'2", and I work in logistics, freight schedules, vendor contracts, the occasional warehouse fire drill at 2 in the morning. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I don't have history with domestic violence situations. I didn't grow up around them. Before all of this, the most I knew about restraining orders was that they existed, that violating them was technically illegal, and that apparently that second part was more complicated than I'd assumed. Becky was 28, 7 months pregnant the afternoon I met her, technically 8 by the time the baby shower came around. She had been trying to leave Richard for 14 months. 14 months of moving, of changing her number, of filing reports, of doing every single thing the system tells you to do, and he was still there. Not always visible, but present the way a pressure system is present. You don't see it, but you feel it in your joints before the weather changes. Richard had 2 tours overseas and a service commendation. He also had a string of arrests that had a strange habit of not converting into actual convictions. A cracked windshield he never directly touched. Voicemails full of concern delivered in a tone that made Becky's hands shake, which the responding officer listened to carefully before explaining there was no explicit threat. A lawyer who knew which words landed in front of which judges. The thing that took me a while to grasp was that Richard wasn't running on rage alone. He was running on architecture. He understood the load-bearing walls of the legal system the way a contractor does, which ones he could cut around, and which ones held weight. The day Becky moved out of their shared apartment, he filed for parental rights. Not because he believed the baby was his. Becky knew it wasn't. She already had a DNA test scheduled, 2 weeks after her due date, at a certified lab. But that test was weeks away. In the meantime, a family court judge had issued a temporary custody order, a 90-day window, granting Richard legal standing to be present in her life without technically violating the restraining order. He didn't need to threaten her. He just needed to stay close until the window opened wider. I learned most of this in the first 40 minutes I knew her. She gave me the facts the way someone does when they've had to explain a situation so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth, just the shape of it left. No edges. I remember thinking, this man has built a cage out of paperwork. And somewhere between the parking lot and the coffee shop, I had walked inside it. The baby shower was 3 weeks after the parking lot. Becky's sister Dana hosted it at her house, a narrow 2-story in a quiet neighborhood, paper streamers on the mailbox, a folding table of food set up in the living room. I arrived in a button-down shirt, introduced myself to people I had never met, and spent the first 30 minutes holding a glass of lemonade and answering polite questions about how Becky and I had met. I kept the story simple. People fill in the blanks themselves if you give them just enough. The reason I was there was a text Richard had sent that morning. No threat, no profanity, just 11 words. Planning to stop by later to see the mother of my child. Becky showed it to me without comment. I read it twice. That was our entire conversation about it. I made one decision before I walked through Dana's door. I was going to be boring. No confrontation, no performance, no raised voices. Just a large, calm man who was clearly not going to move. Richard arrived 40 minutes in. He was well-dressed, pressed collar, clean shoes, and he worked the room with real confidence. Handshakes, a comment about the decorations, the warm smile of someone who had practiced it until it felt natural. He said hello to Becky, called her sweetheart in a voice that was technically affectionate and actually a collar around her throat. Then he looked at me. "Don't think we've met," he said pleasantly. "I'm the baby's father." I shook his hand. "Ryan." Becky's mentioned the custody filing. Something behind his smile recalculated. He recovered fast, I'll give him that, and for the next 10 minutes he addressed the room more than he addressed me. Turned to Dana, to the other guests, made sure everyone understood he was a present, caring, invested father-to-be who just wanted to be involved. He mentioned his lawyer twice. He used the phrase "my rights as a father" once, to a woman holding a gift bag who had absolutely no idea what she'd just been pulled into. I nodded. I let him work the system out loud in front of every person in that room. When he finally left 40 minutes later, without incident, Becky leaned close and said quietly, "He's going to be so much worse now." 3 days later, I found out what worse meant. I walked out to my car in the morning and found the front left tire slashed clean through. Not deflated, slashed. And sitting on the windshield, tucked under the wiper blade, was a photo printed, not texted, of my car parked outside my own apartment building. No note, no name, just the photo, face up, so I couldn't miss it. He hadn't knocked. He had just made sure I knew he'd been there. I filed a police report about the tire that same morning. The officer was thorough and ultimately unhelpful. Probably random, he said. I mentioned that I'd parked in a locked garage every day that week except the one evening I'd driven Becky home. He wrote it down. Nothing came of it. I didn't tell Becky right away. She had enough going on. I told her a week later, when the second photo arrived. Richard sent it directly to her phone. No caption, no message, just a photo of Becky leaving her OB/GYN appointment, taken from across the street. The angle was low, from inside a parked car. He had sat there and waited for her to come out, and then he had taken the picture, and then he had sent it to her. That was all. No threat. Just, I was there. I saw you. I want you to know. She forwarded it to me without saying much. I went to the police with both the tire report and the photo. The officer asked if Richard had made an explicit threat. He hadn't. The photo was concerning, but not criminal on its own. And Richard's lawyer had already successfully argued that the temporary custody order created what he called a co-parenting communication need language that had softened the restraining order's enforcement in ways that were entirely legal and completely deliberate. That phrase was the first time I understood the specific shape of what we were dealing with. Richard hadn't filed for custody just to be present. He had filed to build himself a vocabulary. Every move he made came with a sentence attached that sounded reasonable to a judge who had only met him twice. I bought an external hard drive that week. Every report, every photo, every date and timestamp saved, copied, backed up offsite. I didn't know yet how long the file was going to get. Somewhere in those same weeks, without it being a conversation exactly, I stopped thinking of this as something I'd exit when it got inconvenient. Becky wasn't asking me to stay. She was too careful for that. But I had seen enough to know that walking away would leave the door open wider, and I wasn't built to do that. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, Becky went into labor. Dana was an hour out. I drove her to the hospital, sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, and when the nurse came out and asked, "Are you the father?" I said yes without hesitation. I went in. I held the baby, a girl, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Becky had already decided on the name, Lily. I was still in the room when my phone buzzed. Becky had forwarded me something. Richard had sent flowers to the hospital. The card said, "Can't wait to meet my daughter." And below that, written by hand, Lily's name. The name that had been chosen in that room, that afternoon. Someone on the hospital staff had given it to him. He knew her name before I did, and that was the moment I understood what we were actually dealing with. Lily was 6 weeks old when the first DNA test came back. Richard was not the father. The result was clean, certified, the margin of error negligible. Becky's lawyer filed immediately to have the temporary custody order vacated. I remember the way Becky's voice sounded on the phone when she told me, lighter than I'd heard it in months. I thought, good, now it's over. It wasn't over. Richard's lawyer responded within 48 hours. They were contesting the test on procedural grounds. The chain of custody on the sample, they claimed, had not been properly maintained. They requested a court-ordered second test, administered by a neutral third party under full judicial supervision. The judge, being careful and conservative the way family court judges tend to be with contested paternity cases, granted the request. 90 more days. 90 more days of legal standing. 90 more days of Richard having documented, court-sanctioned reason to exist in the orbit of Becky and Lily. I didn't blame the judge. The request wasn't wrong, technically. Richard had the right to contest. The system was functioning exactly as designed. The problem was that Richard understood the design better than most of the people who had built it. During those 90 days, something shifted in how he operated. The careful, deniable moves were still there, but he started showing up in places that required information he shouldn't have had. Becky's pediatrician's office, a Tuesday morning, a grocery store 20 minutes from her apartment, not the one she normally used, the one she'd specifically switched to. Dana's street, twice, parked 2 houses down with the engine off. He never made contact. He was always just nearby. But within days of each appearance, a photo would arrive on Becky's phone. The pediatrician's parking lot, the grocery store entrance, Dana's mailbox framed in the shot like he'd taken his time with it. No caption. No message. Just, I was there. I cross-referenced the timestamps on those photos against Becky's shared calendar, the one she used for appointments, accessible only to me, Dana, and her lawyer. In 2 of the 3 cases, her location that day wasn't posted anywhere. No social media, no text to friends. The only way Richard could have known was through the calendar or through her phone directly. I didn't make an accusation. I put the timestamps in an email to Becky's lawyer, attached the photos, and let her draw her own conclusions. Becky changed her phone and her passwords that week. Richard found the pediatrician's office again 12 days later. I noticed around this time that I knew Lily's feeding schedule better than my own work calendar. That I kept an overnight bag in my car because it was easier than explaining why I'd driven over at 11 at night 3 times in a week. That Dana had stopped looking surprised when I showed up and started just handing me a cup of coffee at the door. None of it had been decided. It had just become the shape of things. That was the same month Richard called my employer. He identified himself to our office manager as a concerned party conducting informal background inquiries into someone with regular unsupervised access to a young child. He didn't make an allegation. He just asked questions in a tone that implied there were answers worth finding. My manager pulled me into his office that afternoon, his expression somewhere between confused and embarrassed. "Someone called asking about you," he said. I didn't know what to tell them. I opened the documentation file on my phone and walked him through 14 months of police reports. He listened, backed me fully, and told me not to worry about it. He was good about it, but it cost me a morning, a layer of privacy I didn't get back, and the specific exhaustion of having to prove my own character to someone who should never have had to ask. He couldn't touch me legally, so he started touching everything around me instead. The second DNA test was administered 4 months after Lily's birth. Full court supervision this time, both lawyers present. A certified lab technician handled every step of the collection, documented every handoff, signed every form. The judge had personally ordered the protocol after Richard's procedural challenge to the first test, which meant there was no gap in the chain of custody to argue, no sentence Richard's lawyer could construct that a reasonable judge would entertain. Becky and I brought Lily to the testing facility on a Thursday morning. Richard arrived separately, in a suit, with his lawyer. He nodded at me across the waiting room with the same flat, measuring expression he'd used at the baby shower 6 months earlier, a different world. I nodded back. We sat on opposite sides of the room and didn't speak. The results came back 14 days later. Not the father. Clean, certified, uncontestable. Richard's lawyer filed a notice of withdrawal from the custody case 17 days after that. The temporary order was vacated. On paper, the legal portion of this was finished. Becky called me when she got the news. She cried not only the relieved kind. It was the crying of someone who had just been handed proof that all of it had happened anyway. The tire, the 23 photographs, the hospital flowers with Lily's name written by hand, the call to my employer, 14 months of doing everything right and still having him there, in the peripheral vision of every single day. The result didn't undo any of that. It just confirmed that she had never been wrong about any of it. We stayed on the phone for a while without saying much. Then she put Lily down for a nap and said she was going to sleep too. The next morning, I opened the documentation file and counted. 47 police reports across 2 jurisdictions, 112 logged instances of contact or surveillance texts, photos, drive-bys, unannounced appearances, 23 photographs sent directly to Becky's phone, 9 videos. The most significant of which showed Richard sitting in his car outside Lily's pediatrician's office for 91 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, engine running, never getting out, never going in, just watching the entrance until Becky came out with the stroller. I had the responding officer's reports, the timestamps, the calendar correlations flagged in the email I'd sent Becky's lawyer months earlier. I had the documented record of Richard's call to my employer, copies in 3 locations. The external hard drive, a cloud account Richard didn't know existed, and a USB drive in the desk drawer of a retired law enforcement officer I'd trusted for 6 years. Becky's lawyer had been building toward a criminal stalking charge with the district attorney's office for 6 weeks already. The file was the foundation. What we were waiting on was the DA's assessment of whether the documented pattern met the statutory threshold, a process that moved at its own pace, regardless of how urgently the people involved needed it to move. What I didn't anticipate was what losing in court would do to Richard. The careful, procedural version of him, the one who filed motions and sent legally ambiguous texts and understood exactly how much he could do before a charge would stick, started to crack after the withdrawal. A voicemail left for Becky at 2 in the morning, not threatening in language but repeated 6 times in 40 minutes. The same flat voice each time saying he just wanted to talk. A car outside my apartment building, 2 nights in a row, different parking spot, same vehicle. And then a text to my phone, first direct contact he'd ever made with me outside of that baby shower. 4 words. This isn't over yet. He had lost in court twice. Lost procedurally, lost on paper, lost in the only arena where his approach had always worked. A man like Richard, stripped of the system he'd been working, doesn't quietly go home. He just stops being careful. I moved Becky and Lily that weekend. Not to my apartment, I kept those lines deliberate, but to a hotel, paid on my card, registered under a name Richard didn't have access to. Dana knew the location. Nobody else did. I gave Becky a second phone with a new number and told her to use her regular one only for forwarding me whatever Richard sent. We had 72 hours of quiet. Then the front desk called to say a man was asking about us at reception. The man at the front desk had described himself as a family friend checking in on Becky. The clerk, following protocol, had not confirmed or denied any guest by that name. She had called the room instead. Becky had called me. I told Becky to lock the door, push the security latch, and not open it for anyone until she heard from me or the police. Then I called 911 and described the situation, the stalking case, the documentation, the name, the pending DA filing in about 90 seconds. The dispatcher was calm. A unit would be sent for a welfare check. She did not say when. I got in my car. This was not a heroic decision. It was a logistical one. The hotel was 20 minutes away. Police response for a non-emergency welfare check in that part of the city averaged 35 minutes. I knew the number because I had filed enough reports in that jurisdiction to know it by memory. Going was the only calculation that made sense. While I drove, I ran the numbers I had been running for months. Becky was checking the locks 3 times before bed. She was flinching at her own phone buzzing. Lily was 8 months old and picking up on it, sleeping less, crying at sounds that wouldn't have registered 6 months earlier. Becky's legal fees were approaching $11,000. My own out-of-pocket, the hard drive, the hotel, the second phone, the lost workdays was at $14,000 and climbing. Those were the visible costs. The invisible one was simpler. If we didn't force this to a conclusion, Richard would continue. He had already sustained this for over 2 years without once crossing a line that stuck. He had just lost his legal cover. A Richard without procedural protection, I had come to understand, was more dangerous than the one who had been carefully staying inside the lines. The DA filing needed this night. Not as a spark, the case was already built, but as the final piece that turned a documented pattern into an event requiring immediate response. I was 12 minutes out when the phone rang again. Becky's number. When I answered, I heard Lily crying in the background, and a sound I recognized, the specific resistance of a hotel security latch being pushed against from the outside. Then Becky's voice. Flat. Quiet. The flatness I had come to understand meant she was holding herself together by a single thread. He's in the hallway, she said. Ryan. He's right outside the door. I have thought about that moment a lot since then. Not with drama, I'm not built for drama, but with the clarity of a decision that gets made before you're aware you've made it. There was no version of the next few minutes in which I pulled over. There was no version of this in which I stayed in the car. I had held Lily at 7 pounds 4 ounces in a hospital waiting room. I had driven Becky to appointments and sat in parking lots and filed 47 reports and spent $14,000 of my own money. I had been Lily's father in every room that mattered for 8 months straight. I had earned that name even if I had borrowed it at first. I was not putting it down now. I told Becky to stay on the line and pushed the call to the car speaker. When I reached the 4th floor, the hallway was lit with the flat fluorescence of a budget hotel at midnight. The door to their room was not fully closed. The security latch had been forced far enough to compromise the mechanism, a 2-inch gap, door held open by the damaged hardware. I could hear Richard's voice from 10 feet away. Calm. Conversational. The register of someone who had decided that being reasonable was more frightening than being loud. He was telling Becky this didn't have to be a situation. That Ryan was the problem. That Ryan had put ideas in her head and taken his family. That if she would just open the door, they could talk like adults. I put my hand on the door and pushed it open. The room was a standard double. Bed against the far wall, nightstand lamp on, curtain drawn. Becky was to my right with Lily pressed against her chest. Richard was in the space between the bed and the window, about 12 feet from the door. He had a folding knife in his right hand. Blade out, held at his side, not raised, not pointed at anyone. Just open. A statement. An option he was keeping available. I took in the room in 2 seconds. Distance to Richard 12 feet. Distance to Becky and Lily 8 feet to my right. And in the upper left corner of the ceiling, the interior security camera I had noted at check-in, the one that had a clean line of sight to every inch of the room except the bathroom. Richard was standing directly in its frame. I stayed in the doorway. I did not move toward him. The police are 90 seconds out, I said. Put the knife on the bed. Richard looked at me with a smile. The same flat, measuring one from the baby shower, from the testing facility waiting room. The one he used when he was running the calculation. This is between me and Becky, he said. Becky is holding a 7-month-old child, I said. And you're holding a knife. The camera in the upper corner of this room has been recording since you came through that door. I paused. Put the knife on the bed. He looked at the camera, then back at me. I could see it the same calculation he had been running for 2 years, searching for the gap, the angle, the sentence his lawyer could construct. He was looking for the way to work this. There wasn't one. I think some part of him knew it before I said the next thing. I've spent 2 years watching you work the system, I said. The tire, the photographs, the voicemails at 2 in the morning, the call to my employer, 47 police reports. I have copies in 3 locations. The DA has all of it. I kept my voice level. There was no reason to raise it. You're not going to work this system. Not tonight. 4 seconds of silence. Then Richard's composure broke. Not loudly, not the way people imagine these things break. Just the specific, ugly unraveling of a person whose entire strategy has been the appearance of control, suddenly confronted with the fact that the appearance is gone. He said things I won't repeat word for word. Accusations about me, about Becky, about what he'd been owed, about what I had taken. The self-justifying logic of someone who had believed his own narrative so completely that being seen clearly felt like an attack. He called me a liar. He called Becky something I won't repeat. He took 1 step toward me. I did not move from the doorway. The first officer came up the stairwell to my left about 30 seconds later. A second through the elevator. A third behind the first. Richard did not put the knife down until the third officer stepped into the hallway. One last read of the room, one last check of the math, and then he set it on the nightstand. Not the bed, where I had told him to put it. The nightstand. One final, small assertion that he was still making choices. Then he put his hands up. They put him face down on the carpet of room 412. Lily was crying from the center of the bed where Becky had set her to keep both arms free. The security camera recorded everything: the knife, the step forward, the surrender, the officers, the timestamp reading 11:58 p.m. from an angle that left nothing open to interpretation. I stayed in the doorway until the room was fully secure. I did not touch Richard. I didn't have to. The camera did the work. 2 years of documentation did the work. 47 police reports and a hotel security camera did what 100 carefully worded voicemails and 1 contested DNA test had been designed to prevent. They put the truth in a room where it couldn't be argued away. By the following morning, the DA's office had the hotel footage, the responding officers' reports, and the full documentation file. Richard was charged with criminal stalking, breaking and entering, and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. His prior record, all those arrests that had never quite converted, all those careful years of staying just inside the lines, was now a pattern the DA could lay in front of a jury. He was denied bail. The man who had spent 2 years working every system available to him had just been held by one. Richard pled guilty 14 months after the hotel. Aggravated assault, criminal stalking. In exchange for the plea, the DA reduced the breaking and entering to a lesser charge. He was sentenced to 6 years. I don't have strong feelings about the number. What I have feelings about is what the DA said during sentencing, that the documentation file, all 47 reports and 26 months of logged contact and 9 videos and 2 certified DNA tests, demonstrated not a man struggling with trauma, but a man who had understood exactly what he was doing and had done it as carefully as he could for as long as it worked. Richard's lawyer argued PTSD from military service. The judge acknowledged the service and sentenced him anyway. The system held. It just needed us to stay in it longer than Richard expected. For a while after that, things were quiet in a way that took some getting used to. Becky spent 3 months in therapy before she stopped checking the locks before bed. She had her own life to put back together, and she needed space to do that. I gave her the space. I also kept showing up for Lily's 9-month checkup. For the Tuesday evenings when Dana had work and Becky needed an extra set of hands, for the slow, ordinary accumulation of time that doesn't look like anything from the outside but adds up to everything eventually. Lily turned 2 months after the guilty plea. We had a small party: Dana, a few of Becky's friends, a grocery store cake with one candle. I sat on the floor and helped Lily work through the cake with her hands and thought about a parking lot 3 years earlier, and a stranger with shaking hands asking me for a few hours of my Tuesday. One evening, a few weeks later, Becky and I were doing dishes while Lily slept. She turned and asked, quietly, whether I still thought of myself as pretending. I said no. She said she didn't either. I started as a stranger. I stayed because he never just leaves. And I'm still here because it turns out pretending, done long enough, and for the right reasons, stops being pretending at all.